Now we introduce for loops. I've started to type an example into the shell here. For is the required first word. Count is just a variable name. In is a requirement. Then we have a sequence, in this case a list, and a colon has to come at the end. Colon in Python always ends a heading. After that you indent, as the shell does here automatically. In this case, to give lines to repeat, let's write print count, and another line, let's say print quote yes and quote times count. Close parentheses. Whoops, I got the wrong kind of quote there. There we are. Now when you enter something indented under a heading in the shell, you have to give an extra return to let it know you're done. And there we are. So let's see what happened. The idea here is that count is used as a name for one of the values in this sequence in order. First, count is set equal to 1, and then we go through the body here underneath the heading. And so if count is 1, we print 1 and print yes 1 times. 1, 1 yes. When we reach the bottom of the loop, we go back to, let's say the last place where this is indented, we go back to the heading and make count then be the next value in the sequence, in this case 2, and we go through the body again. Now count has a different value, so we're printing 2 and yes twice. 2 and yes twice. And again, when we hit the bottom of the indented part, we go back to the heading here, which tells us to set count to the next item 3, and then we go through the loop again, print 3 and yes 3 times, and there we are. And at this point, technically, we would go back and check for another item, and there isn't one, and we're done with the loop, and we would go on to the next statement if there were one. Back to the tutorial, we show the general format here of a for loop. It starts with the keyword for, and this is just some variable name referring to a particular item in the sequence, the required word in, and then some kind of a sequence, often a list. The colon is required always at the end of headings, and after the colon we have an indented, consistently indented set of statements that are repeated for each choice for item in the sequence. I already went through the code line by line, but here I've got a table if we were to formally play computer. Here let me bring up where we can see it at the same time, the original code. I've numbered the lines, and the point here is that these following the line numbers, they do not just go completely sequentially because of the loops. Line 3 was the bottom of the indented part, and so every time we come back to the heading, which is line 1, so we loop around and the line numbers do not go completely consecutively. So it is important to be able to follow through and keep track of this. The comments in the table here just correspond to what we were showing when I was going through it and pointing to individual lines before. Let's go on and look at a longer set of code in a program. This is example program 4123. Now I've got the same loop that we had in the shell here, but I point out that if we're in a program, we don't have to have a blank line if we don't want to. Just dedenting here is enough, or that's the opposite of indenting, terminology used in Python programs. Just dedenting here is enough to see that this is the end of the loop. So after the for statement here is completed, the next statement is this print statement. And then here I've given us another loop, this time going through a list of colors. Let's run this quick. And you see we get the same thing we had before, down to the 3 yeses, then the specific line done counting, and then the loop for colors prints out the 3 items in that list. Now, the indentation as it was in functions, is extremely important here. Let me adjust this, indenting this print statement, which you can do, by the way, do with tab. Think what's going to happen now. Let's check it. First I'll hit Control S to save, F5 to run, and we get a new version. 1 yes, done counting, nope. 2 yes, done counting, 3 yes, done counting, and then red, blue, green. Let's go back. And this makes perfect sense if you look at the code, because now this print statement is a part of the for loop body. It happens at the bottom of each time through the loop, so it's now lying. You're not done counting. So you've got to be very careful with your indentation. Loops are one of the most important features in programming, and we're back in the tutorial now. And the syntax is pretty simple, but using them can really be quite a trick. It's one of the hardest challenges for beginning programmers. One way that I like to simplify the learning curve is to classify common situations and patterns. One of the simplest patterns, what we just illustrated above, it's a for each loop. Basically, we went through, we of course gave a name item which can refer to any element of the sequence, and then we just do something with the current item. You know, in the examples above, it was print, maybe use it to count how many times you're going to print yes. All right, but basically for each item, we did a corresponding thing with that item. That's the simplest idea of how to process a bunch of items in a similar way. The name I give this pattern is a for each loop. Let's look at a place where we could do something in this form, what we've seen already. This is code from the madlib program, where we prompted the user for responses for animal, food, and city. And you see that these 3 lines have a very similar format. We could rewrite this as a for each loop. We're doing this corresponding things for each of these 3 values. So let me see, this was the Q for the user, so I'll make that be the variable here. So for Q in the list of values that we wanted to use, this can be our for loop heading. Then the part we're doing, just substituting a different Q, is add pick with that Q and the user picks. So this slightly compresses this sequence of 3 statements. If there were many more that we were testing here, this would be much shorter. And we'll see, particularly if there are several lines here that are corresponding, this is much easier to read. You see the pattern just once. Here in the tutorial, I place computer on this basically, and here we combine both a loop and a function call. So the first time through when Q is animal, I call this function with animal. And then the next time Q is food, I call this function with food. And finally, the last time through, Q is city, and I call this function with Q being city. And again, that exactly corresponds to what we had here.